You're the poster child for dangerous improvisation that could cost us our accreditation. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 48 minutes before a Black Hawk landed in his parking lot. Cedar Creek Medical's night shift hums under fluorescent lights that flicker in Corridor 3, casting shadows across scuffed linoleum. The hospital smells like antiseptic and the ghost of 1,000 sleepless nights. Natalie Hayes moves through the ICU with the economy of motion that comes from someone who once moved through Helmand Province with the same precision, surgical, purposeful, leaving no wasted energy. Her scrubs are faded from industrial washing, the blue worn almost grey at the elbows. Her left forearm carries a scar that traces from wrist to elbow like a map of a different life, and she keeps a pair of worn combat boots in her trunk, visible when she retrieves her lunch cooler each shift. It is 11:38 p.m. on a Tuesday. The ward is quiet. That is when quiet is most dangerous. She is charting vitals in Bay 4 when she notices the resident staring. A young woman, maybe 26, with the kind of eyes that haven't yet learned not to watch too hard. Natalie has just completed a chest tube placement on a 73-year-old with spontaneous pneumothorax. The procedure itself was textbook, 18-gauge needle, second intercostal space, midclavicular line. But the angle of insertion was unusual. 14 degrees. Not the standard approach taught in any American nursing program. An angle that works because Natalie learned it in Kandahar, learned it from a combat surgeon who had placed 64 of these tubes in field conditions where textbook meant dead. The patient stabilizes. Oxygen saturation climbs from 84 to 91 to 96. The tremor in his breathing eases. His color improves. All of this takes 3 minutes. The resident is still watching, her pen suspended over her notes. Natalie does not acknowledge her. She documents her time, 23:51, and moves to the next patient without a sound. But someone else is watching from the nurse's station. Dr. Marshall Caldwell. 52 years old, corner office with a view of the San Antonio skyline, a reputation built on accreditation scores and administrative efficiency rather than actual patient outcomes. He has been the chief of nursing services at Cedar Creek Medical for 8 years. He has never lost a political battle. He has also never seen a chest tube placed at that angle. Caldwell is standing when Natalie finishes her charting. He approaches as she is documenting the final vitals, his tablet in hand. His voice is calibrated for the audience of interns nearby, loud enough to be heard, measured enough to sound reasonable. Nurse Hayes, we need to discuss your creative interpretations of protocol. There is something in the way he says it. Something that tells her he has been waiting for an excuse. She meets his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. A full stop. Nothing more. Then she nods once and returns to her documentation without a word. Her pen does not shake. Her breath does not change. Her hands remain perfectly still on the keyboard. He had no idea that her silence was not submission. It was operational security. It was the voice of someone who once operated in the darkness where every word could be reported, where every gesture could be weaponized. Where the best defense was to give enemies nothing to work with. This is a professional conversation, Nurse Hayes, Caldwell says. His jaw tightens. He is not accustomed to being ignored. My office. 10 minutes. She finishes typing the last vital. 23:54, pulse 78. Blood pressure 128/71. Oxygen saturation 97. Perfect. The patient will live because of the angle. The angle that should not have worked but did. Of course, Doctor, Natalie says quietly. 10 words exactly. Compliant. Deferent. The right tone. Everything he wants to hear. She does not look at him again. The office is on the 3rd floor. Caldwell's office is designed to intimidate. Mahogany desk. Leather chair positioned so he sits higher than visitors. Diplomas on the wall, Yale, Johns Hopkins residency, an MBA from Northwestern. Framed photographs of Caldwell receiving awards, Caldwell at hospital galas, Caldwell shaking hands with hospital board members whose names carry weight in San Antonio's medical establishment. The air smells like expensive cologne and air freshener trying to cover something underneath. Ambition, perhaps. Caldwell closes the door. He does not invite her to sit. That technique you used tonight, he begins, moving behind his desk. The angle of insertion. That is not Cedar Creek protocol. It stabilized the patient faster, Natalie says. Her voice is steady. Reasonable. Oxygen saturation improved in under 4 minutes. Normal recovery time is 6 to 8. That is not how we do things here, Caldwell says. He sets his tablet on the desk. We follow evidence-based practice guidelines established by the American Association of Critical Care Nurses. Not improvisation. Not freelancing. He pauses. Dangerously freelancing. Do you understand the position that puts me in? The room is very quiet. The fluorescent lights hum above them. Outside, San Antonio sleeps. She can hear the distant sound of a siren, probably from the ER entrance. An ambulance. Someone else's emergency. I understand, Natalie says. Our accreditation depends on demonstrated compliance with established protocols, Caldwell continues. His voice is rising now, though he clearly means to keep it controlled. If the board sees irregular practices, unorthodox procedures, especially from someone without standard credentials, they will question my oversight. They will question whether Cedar Creek Medical maintains adequate quality control. Do you see what I am saying? She does. He is not actually concerned about patient outcomes. He is concerned about audit trails and board meetings and whether anyone will notice that his department chair is being challenged by a nurse who saves lives in 3 minutes instead of 6. I see, Doctor, Natalie says. Good. He sits down, which means she is dismissed from standing in front of his desk, but he does not invite her to leave. I expect standard protocol from this moment forward. No exceptions. No innovations. No angles. If I see another incident like this, we will need to have a much more serious conversation about your future at Cedar Creek. She nods once. Then she turns and walks out of his office without asking permission. The elevator back down is empty. She watches the numbers descend, 3, 2, 1, the doors open to the lobby. The night shift continues. Another ambulance arrives. She can hear the sirens now, louder, the sound of the ER bay doors opening, the controlled chaos of impact. She does not go toward it. She goes toward the break room instead, toward the vending machine that hums alone in the hallway near the back stairwell. The machine smells like plastic and old electricity. She inserts $1.50 for coffee she does not particularly want, just to have a reason to stand here, to have her hands occupied with something that requires no thought. That is when the EMT finds her. He is in his middle 50s, with the kind of grey in his beard that comes from 30 years of seeing things that cannot be unseen. His name tag says Clayton. He worked the Kandahar Forward Operating Base from 2009 to 2011. He does not say this. He does not need to. She sees it in the way he moves, the way his eyes track exits, the way he stands with his back to the corner. That needle decompression angle, he says quietly. He is standing close enough that no one else would hear, far enough that he is not threatening. Second intercostal, 14 degrees. You learned that in Marja, didn't you? The coffee drops into the machine. She does not reach for it immediately. She stands very still. Her heart rate does not change. Her breathing remains even. But for 3 seconds, the entire operation, the disappearance, the erased records, the new identity as a civilian nurse, is balanced on a knife's edge. She meets his eyes for 3 seconds. Exactly 3. Then she reaches for her coffee and walks away without confirming anything. Clayton does not follow her. He stands by the vending machine, understanding that some silences are more honest than any words. That some people are designed to be invisible. That some nurses carry scars that tell stories nobody is supposed to know. Natalie walks back to the ICU. The patient in bay 4 is stable. His oxygen saturation holds at 97. His breathing is easy. He will be transferred to the step-down unit in the morning. He will recover because of an angle that should not have worked, an angle learned in a place that no longer officially exists, from a surgeon who is probably dead now, in a conflict that has been rewritten so many times that nobody remembers the truth anymore. She does her rounds. She charts her vitals. She does her job with the precision of someone who has spent 15 years moving through darkness where mistakes cost lives. And she does not think about the fact that her cover just developed a hairline fracture. She does not think about what happens when soldiers recognize other soldiers, when one person sees through the uniform to the person underneath. She does not think about the fact that Clayton knows, that he could report her, that the threads holding her civilian identity together are thinner than she thought. Instead, she finishes her shift at 7:03 a.m. She clocks out. She walks to her car in the San Antonio heat that is already turning the asphalt soft. She retrieves her lunch cooler and sees, as she always does, the pair of worn combat boots in the trunk. The boots are the only proof that she ever existed before Cedar Creek Medical. The only proof that Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes was ever real at all. She closes the trunk. The auditorium lights dim to a surgical white as 70 staff members filled the tiered seating of Cedar Creek Medical's Grand Rounds amphitheater. Dr. Caldwell stood center stage, his Italian leather shoes gleaming under the spots, a laser pointer balanced in his right hand like a conductor's baton. Natalie stood where he'd positioned her, against the side wall, 3 steps back, exactly where visiting medical students stand during teaching rounds. Not where faculty stands. Where problems stand. "Let me present what I call the cowboy nurse syndrome," Caldwell announced, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a man who'd spent 15 years perfecting his stage presence. He clicked to the first slide. Natalie's patient file bloomed across the projection screen behind him, magnified so large that her handwriting became a confessional. "This is Nurse Hayes. Night shift. Minimal supervision. Minimal oversight. And apparently, minimal adherence to our protocols." Laughter rippled through the residents seated in the front rows. A few attending physicians exchanged glances, the kind that said they were grateful they weren't the one being dissected. Caldwell advanced to the next slide. A chest X-ray filled the screen. 42-year-old male presenting with pneumothorax. Standard needle decompression required a 14-gauge angiocath at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Standard approach. Our protocols. He circled the anatomical landmark with his laser pointer, the red dot moving like a target reticle. But our Nurse Hayes here decided that evidence-based medicine was optional. He paused, letting that word hang. Optional. Where did you train? The parking lot. The amphitheater erupted. Not actual laughter, something sharper. The sound of a room recognizing that someone was being hunted. Natalie's jaw tightened. The muscle at her left temple flickered once, almost imperceptible. Her eyes fixed on a point above the crowd, somewhere near the exit sign where the light had begun to fade. Her hands remained at her sides, fingers straight, palms facing forward, a position so controlled it looked like parade rest. Not even a millimeter of tremor. Not even a blink. The angle she used, Caldwell continued, advancing slides with the rhythm of a prosecuting attorney entering evidence, deviates 17 degrees from protocol. 17 degrees. The needle went in at an angle that, according to textbook anatomy, should have clipped the anterior intercostal artery. He let that sink in. Should have caused a hemothorax. Should have killed him. Another pause. The kind that makes silence feel like a weapon. But it didn't. Why? Because she got lucky. And luck, ladies and gentlemen, is not a clinical outcome. Luck is negligence that happened not to have consequences. The room exhaled. Several residents scribbled notes. One attending physician leaned back in her chair with the expression of someone watching a professional execution. This improvisation, Caldwell said, his voice dropping into a register that sounded almost sympathetic, almost concerned, is exactly how we lose our Joint Commission accreditation. How we get sued. How a hospital's reputation, a reputation built on 63 years of excellence, gets destroyed by a single reckless decision. He didn't look at Natalie when he said it. Instead, he turned to face the crowd directly, his expression the picture of reluctant duty. How I lose my department. That was the final sentence. Not directed at her. Directed at them. The implication sharp as a scalpel, she was threatening his position. His authority. His control. The presentation continued for another 11 minutes. Caldwell walked through for more cases, each one framed as protocol deviation, each one conveniently leaving out the actual outcomes. The patient she'd saved using an unconventional fluid resuscitation technique was presented as reckless volume replacement. The pediatric airway she'd secured using a size 4.0 endotracheal tube was completely outside her scope. Every intervention that had worked was recontextualized as violation. Every life saved was reduced to luck. Natalie didn't move. Her breathing remained steady. Her eyes tracked him once around the amphitheater, not watching, just observing, the way a surveillance camera observes. When he finished and the attending physicians began applauding, she turned and walked toward the exit with the same even pace she used when walking toward any door. Not faster. Not slower. Not apologetic. Just gone. The basement vending machines hummed with the sound of 5 different refrigeration units running in concert. It was the kind of noise that made the space feel hollow, like a bunker where nothing else existed. Natalie inserted her card and selected black coffee, the only thing in the machine that came without sugar, without additives, without anything that required chewing. The cup fell with a plastic click into the dispenser. Steam rose. She raised it to her mouth without drinking it, just breathing in the bitter heat. A figure moved against the wall to her left. Veteran EMT named Rodriguez. He'd been waiting. That needle angle, he said quietly, not turning to face her, just speaking to the vending machines like they were the only audience that mattered. 17 degrees off protocol. I saw a combat medic use that exact approach in Marja. Helmand Province, Sanjin Valley. IED casualty. The textbook method would have clipped the anterior intercostal vessel. This angle threaded right through the space. He paused. Saved a guy who should have bled out. SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. Natalie took a drink of her coffee. The temperature was perfect. Just hot enough to require careful sips. Just cold enough that she could consume it without rushing. I saw it used 3 more times after that, Rodriguez continued. Every time, same result. The Marines who taught it called it the Marja angle. Said it was worth more than protocol sometimes. Worth more than textbooks. He finally turned his head slightly, not making direct eye contact, just allowing his peripheral vision to register her presence. I always wondered who passed it on. Never found out. 3 seconds of silence. Just 3. Then Natalie set down her coffee cup on the counter, turned, and walked away without confirming anything. Her footsteps echoed in the stairwell. By the time she reached the ground floor, Rodriguez was still standing by the vending machines, staring at the reflection of the fluorescent lights in the glass. That afternoon, a formal review notice appeared in her personnel file, delivered by Caldwell's assistant at 2:44 p.m., a timestamp Natalie would remember with the kind of precision that came from years of logging critical events. Pattern of protocol deviation. Credentialing questions. Pending internal investigation. The letter was professional, measured, airtight. It didn't accuse her of anything. It just raised questions. Lots of them. By evening, Security Chief Morrison, a former MP who'd worked under someone, somewhere, in some role that gave him the bearing of a man who'd made decisions that cost lives, commented loudly while Natalie passed through the main lobby. Doc says you might need an escort soon. Want to make sure you're not taking anything that doesn't belong to you. He was arranging some papers on the security desk, not looking at her directly, just speaking the words into the space she occupied. Natalie signed out at the front desk. Her pen strokes were perfectly even, each letter formed with the same pressure and angle as the last. She didn't rush. She didn't pause. The security guard watched her turn the logbook back toward him and walk toward the parking lot with her badge still clipped to her scrubs. She'd leave it on his desk tomorrow. For now, she carried it like a weight she hadn't yet decided how to set down. The drive home was silent except for the sound of tires on wet asphalt. It had rained while she was inside. The city smelled like petrichor and diesel exhaust, the air pressure having shifted in that way that comes before a larger storm. She knew the feeling. She'd felt it before. The kind of pressure that came before everything changed. Monday morning arrived with the weight of the next phase. Dr. Caldwell sat in his office at 6:58 a.m., his coffee still steaming, his computer showing the email he'd already drafted 3 times and deleted. By 7:02 a.m., his personal cell phone was ringing. Board Chair Patricia Whitmore. He'd timed it for her standing morning coffee meeting, the moment when she'd be most available and most concerned about operational liability. "Patricia, thank you for taking my call." Caldwell's voice carried the texture of genuine worry, the carefully calibrated tone of a man protecting something precious. "I have a situation that requires board awareness. We have a nurse with questionable credentials performing procedures significantly outside her scope. A cardiac tamponade intervention. Needle decompression using non-standard angles. The kind of thing that..." He let the silence work for him. If Joint Commission finds this during next month's accreditation review, it could trigger an investigation into our credentialing process. That triggers an investigation into departmental oversight. That triggers an investigation into how I approved certain hires. The conversation lasted 12 minutes. By the time it ended, Patricia Whitmore had agreed to place the issue on the quarterly board agenda. Not because she believed what Caldwell was telling her, but because she couldn't afford not to take him seriously. Tuesday brought phone calls. Caldwell personally contacted the 3 references listed on Natalie's hiring paperwork. The first was a disconnected number. The second was a voicemail box that never returned calls. The third went to a Pentagon receptionist who couldn't confirm that the person Caldwell was asking about had ever existed. He documented each attempt meticulously, building a file labeled Hayes Credentialing Concerns with screenshots and timestamps and printed call logs. By Wednesday, he'd commissioned an external audit of her patient files through a consultant friend at Methodist Hospital, framed as quality assurance, but really just another layer of investigation, another trail to follow, another way to build the architecture of her dismissal. The auditor would look at 17 of her cases. 17 outcomes. 17 interventions that had worked but violated protocol. 17 pieces of evidence. What he didn't know was what happened on Thursday. Thursday evening, Caldwell met his attorney brother-in-law at a steakhouse on the Riverwalk. They ordered expensive cuts of beef and discussed options for terminating a problem employee with minimal legal exposure. The conversation was professional, detailed, the kind of discussion that people in power have when they're deciding how to remove someone inconvenient from their world. They discussed documentation. They discussed timing. They discussed the strategic value of making it look like her resignation had been voluntary. What Caldwell didn't know was that his Wednesday records request, sent through his friend at the Department of Defense to verify Natalie's naval credentials, had pinged a classified alert in a JSOC facility in Virginia Beach. A lieutenant commander named Graves stared at a red-flagged screen showing a single name, Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. Status: erased. Instruction: do not surface. Alert level: critical. Graves picked up a secure line that didn't appear in any phone records and made a call to someone whose name he never spoke aloud. Friday night at Cedar Creek Medical came apart at 11:48 p.m. when a semi-truck crossed the median on I-35 near the Brackenridge exit. 7 vehicles. Multiple rollovers. The dispatch alert screamed across the ER monitors before the first ambulance siren crested the hill, and Natalie felt the pressure change in the room the way animals feel a storm coming. The air itself seemed to compress. Trauma activation, the overhead announced. 7 incoming. ETA 8 minutes. Dr. Caldwell wasn't on call. That meant Dr. Morrison, the attending, would run trauma alone until backup arrived, and Natalie knew what that meant. She was already moving toward Bay 4, pulling supplies with the practiced efficiency of someone whose hands had done this 1,000 times. The ER nurses scattered like water droplets on hot steel, each one flowing into position without needing to be directed. The trauma bay hummed with the sound of ventilators being tested, crash carts wheeled into place, the metallic clink of tray tables extending. The first ambulance arrived with a 48-year-old man with a femur fracture and a face that had met a dashboard hard enough to shatter cheekbones. The second brought a child, maybe 6, with a pneumothorax that was already being managed with a needle decompression in the field. The third and fourth came through with critical injuries that demanded every available resource. And then the fifth ambulance backed up to Bay 4. Male, 22, Marine Corps, multiple blunt force trauma, the paramedic called out, already rattling off vitals that were declining like a stock market before a crash. Pressure dropping. We got him on 2 liters O2. For access, the stretcher rolled in with controlled urgency, and Natalie saw the dog tags first, still around his neck, catching the fluorescent light. Lance Corporal Chen. The tags read a USMC and a service number that meant he'd been serving when Natalie herself was still trying to convince the world she was nobody important. She caught the handoff with the precision of someone who'd caught 50 exactly like it. How long since the collision? 12 minutes, the paramedic said. Vehicle rolled 3 times. He was ejected partially, then rolled back in. Chest compression trauma, definitely. Chen's eyes were still open. That was good. That was bad. It meant consciousness, but it also meant he was tracking his own decline, watching his oxygen saturation drop on the monitor like a man watching his lifespan tick backward. His breathing was shallow. Muffled heart sounds came through the stethoscope when Natalie placed it, the kind of muffled that meant fluid, and her mind already knew what her hands were about to confirm. Distended jugular veins. Blood pressure 92/60 and sliding. The textbook presentation of cardiac tamponade was writing itself across Chen's vital signs like a prophecy none of them could stop. I need a pericardiocentesis kit, Natalie said quietly, already positioning Chen at a 30-degree angle, her hands moving with the muscle memory of 100 field operations under conditions far worse than this well-lit, temperature-controlled bay. Marja. Forward operating bases where the lights ran on generators that could cut out mid-procedure. Dusty tents where you learn to work by the light of a headlamp and nothing else. Dr. Morrison's tied up in trauma too, another nurse said. Pediatric case. I called for the surgical fellow. I need the kit now, Natalie said. Seconds mattered. Chen's pressure was 85/55. The monitor showed his heart rate climbing, tachycardia, a desperate rhythm, the body's alarm bell screaming that it was drowning in its own fluid. Natalie's jaw was perfectly still. Her hands were already assembling what she needed, the 18-gauge needle, the syringe, the tubing. Her fingers moved with the kind of certainty that came from having done this before the world complicated itself with protocols and committees and men like Caldwell who needed their paperwork more than they needed their patients to live. Dr. Patel arrived then, a surgical fellow maybe 3 years out of residency, still moving with the careful deliberation of someone who consulted the rulebook before executing every step. He was gowning up, moving through the pre-procedure ritual with methodical precision, and Natalie watched him for exactly 2 seconds before understanding the timeline. Chen's pressure had dropped to 80/40. The clock was running at a speed that didn't care about proper procedure hierarchy. It didn't care about chain of command or chain of custody or any chain except the one tethering Lance Corporal Chen to consciousness. Natalie landmarked the xiphoid process with her gloved finger, one point of reference. The angle was 45 degrees toward the left shoulder, the kind of angle her muscle memory held like a secret. She advanced the needle with the kind of certainty that looked casual to anyone who didn't understand that certainty was the opposite of hesitation. The needle slid through skin, through fascia, through the pericardial sac, and the syringe filled with blood. 50 milliliters. The hiss of air escaping when she drew the plunger back, releasing pressure that had been crushing Chen's heart for the 12 minutes since that semi-truck decided physics didn't apply to it. Chen's pressure climbed. 85/60 within 30 seconds. 92/65 within 45. The monitor's alarm silenced like it was being erased by a hand that knew exactly which button to push. Dr. Patel froze mid-glove, his hand stalled in the ritual he'd been executing. His eyes went from the monitor, which was now showing stabilizing vitals, to Natalie's hands, which were already securing the line with the kind of fluid efficiency that looked like choreography. That was, you didn't wait for. His voice had the tone of someone watching the rules he'd spent 7 years learning suddenly rearrange themselves. His pressure was dropping, Natalie said. No apology. No explanation. Just statement. The kind of voice that came from someone who'd learned early that words were wait, and wait was expensive. Dr. Morrison appeared then, moving between bays with the exhausted focus of a trauma attending who'd already saved 3 lives and was about to save a 4th without knowing he already had. He took one look at Chen's improved vitals, the secured line, the blood still dark in the syringe, and his face cycled through relief to confusion to something harder, the expression of a man watching someone else execute a procedure with precision that didn't match the credentials on her badge. An Army veteran named Jackson was standing in the doorway, a trauma nurse pulled in for the overflow, someone who'd spent years in field medicine before deciding San Antonio hospitals were quiet to work. He'd watched the entire procedure from the hallway, and Natalie felt his eyes on her hands with the weight of recognition. Not just of the technique. Of the absolute certainty in her movements, the economy of motion, the way her shoulders stayed relaxed while her hands did work that should have made her tense. The kind of hands that had held lives together in conditions where holding anything together was a form of defiance. But that wasn't the worst part. By the time Chen was being transferred to the ICU for observation, the incident reports were already being drafted. 3 separate nurses had documented unauthorized invasive procedure and gross insubordination. One had noted procedure performed without waiting for attending physician or surgical fellow approval. Another had highlighted advanced procedure performed by nursing staff beyond scope of practice. Natalie finished her charting at 4 a.m., her hand steady on the keyboard, her face as composed as a statue carved from someone who'd learned long ago that trembling was a luxury for people with something left to lose. She clocked out. She sat in her car in the Cedar Creek parking lot with the engine running and the dashboard lights painting her face in shades of blue and green. The combat boots sat in the trunk where they always did, leather worn soft from use, laces still tied from the last operation where she'd pulled them on and the world had rearranged itself into something classified. At 6:38 a.m., Dr. Caldwell opened his email on his personal laptop at home and read through the incident reports. His face moved through surprise to anger to something colder, the expression of a man who understood that Natalie Hayes had just given him exactly what he needed to justify every suspicion he'd harbored. By 8 a.m., he'd scheduled an emergency meeting with HR for Monday. The suspension letter was already being drafted in his mind, word by perfect word. He understood the law of institutional momentum. Once a narrative begins, it tends to continue in the direction it's already moving. And the narrative here was clear. Insubordination. Scope violation. A nurse operating outside her authority, threatening the hospital's accreditation standing, the kind of liability that insurance companies never forgave. What Caldwell didn't understand was that every move he'd made so far had been strategic, calculated, the actions of a competent adversary. But what was about to happen would force him into a different category entirely, the category of desperation, where competence became irrelevant and the machinery he'd spent years building would begin to grind against him instead of for him. Natalie drove to the diner on the interstate that stayed open all night. She ordered black coffee that went cold while she stared out the window at the parking lot where 18-wheelers pulled in and out like mechanical respirations. The coffee cup sat untouched. The combat boot sat in her trunk. and the classified alert that had been triggered by Caldwell's records request was already moving up the chain of command at JSOC, crossing desks that hadn't seen Natalie Hayes' name in 4 years, coming to rest on a tablet in the hands of someone whose call sign was Graves and who had authority that didn't answer to hospital accreditation boards or HR committees or any of the structures that Caldwell believed kept the world organized. Monday morning arrived with the smell of antiseptic and finality. Natalie clocked in at 6:22 a.m., her badge scanning with its familiar beep, her mind already on the day's patient assignments. She'd made it as far as the break room before the overhead speaker crackled, "Hayes, report to Dr. Caldwell's office immediately." Not a request. Not a question. She set down her coffee, still steaming, black, no sugar, and turned toward the administrative corridor without expression. Dr. Caldwell sat behind his mahogany desk like a general who'd finally positioned his pieces correctly. His tablet was propped against a leather portfolio, and his smile was the kind that suggested he'd been waiting for this moment since Friday night. "Effective immediately," he said before she'd even closed the door, "you are suspended pending formal investigation into Friday's unauthorized medical intervention. That procedure violated every protocol we have." Natalie stepped forward and placed her ID badge and hospital credentials on his desk. The plastic hit the mahogany with a soft click. She set them side by side, perfectly aligned, and her hands were completely steady, the hands of someone who'd already survived worse than dismissal. "You're making a mistake," Caldwell continued, his voice carrying the tone of a man delivering a sentence he'd rehearsed. "An expensive one. But my legal team is prepared." He leaned back in his chair, savoring the moment. "You can have security escort you out, or you can walk. Your choice." She turned and walked. The corridor seemed longer than it had the day before. Natalie's scrubs whispered against her legs as she moved through the hallway, aware of every pair of eyes tracking her progress. By noon, Caldwell had made his move. He'd called his college roommate, now a senior investigator with the FBI's Federal Records Division, and framed the entire situation as civic duty wrapped in concern. "I believe we may be dealing with credential fraud," he'd said. His voice on the call would have been smooth, reasonable, the voice of a man protecting his institution. "She may be operating under a false identity. I need this investigated before someone gets killed." The lie was elegant because it carried a seed of truth. Natalie Hayes did operate under an identity that wasn't hers anymore. The credential fraud was inverted, the degrees were real, the certifications legitimate, but the person holding them had been officially dead for 4 years. Caldwell had no idea what he'd actually triggered. At 2:19 p.m., 2 FBI agents arrived at Cedar Creek Medical. They weren't there about Friday's unauthorized procedure. They were there because Dr. Caldwell had activated a federal favor, called in a connection, and started a chain that would escalate beyond anything he understood. They walked through the ER with their badges visible, asking for Natalie Hayes. The ward clerk pointed toward the staff parking lot where she was loading the last of her personal items into her car. The escort took 90 seconds. From the moment they approached her vehicle to the moment she walked past the security desk where her badge and scrubs had been deposited into a plastic bag, 90 seconds elapsed. Every nurse, resident, and family member in the main corridor watched. Natalie's face showed nothing, not the anger that would have been justified, not the fear that would have been rational, not the humiliation that Caldwell had orchestrated so carefully. Her expression remained the same as it had been on Friday when he'd paraded her through grand rounds like a cautionary tale. She wore composure like armor. She drove for 40 minutes without destination, taking turns on autopilot, until she found herself exiting at a random off-ramp near Highway 90. The diner sign read roses in faded pink neon. At 3 a.m., she sat in a corner booth with cracked vinyl seating and a window that faced the empty parking lot. Her coffee went cold beside an untouched plate of eggs and toast. The waitress, a woman with 30 years of service work written in the lines around her eyes, had asked if she needed anything else, and Natalie had said, "No. I don't think I need anything anymore." The combat boots sat on the seat beside her. She'd retrieved them from her car trunk before entering the diner. The leather was weathered beyond casual wear, creased in ways that spoke of specific terrain, specific climates, specific moments when they'd carried her through situations where making a mistake meant people died. Dust from Marja still settled in the treads despite for years of time and distance. The boots were the only physical evidence that Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes had ever existed before Cedar Creek Medical. In the black glass of the diner window, she saw her reflection staring back, a woman in civilian clothes, hair down, no badge, no rank, no unit patch. A ghost staring at ghosts. She'd been erased so thoroughly that even saving Lance Corporal Chen's life became evidence of the person she wasn't supposed to be. The military disavowal had been total and intentional. Her service record sealed. Her unit disbanded and reorganized under a new designation. Her name was removed from every database except one, the classified one that someone, somewhere, was still monitoring. What that someone had just been sent was a records request for Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes from a civilian hospital in San Antonio. The request came from someone without clearance, without authorization, and without any idea that accessing certain names triggered certain alerts. Those alerts moved up the chain of command at JSOC with the urgency of someone touching a live wire. The alerts crossed desks that hadn't seen her name in for years. They came to rest on a tablet held by someone whose call sign was Graves and whose authority didn't answer to hospital accreditation boards or HR committees or any of the civilian structures that Caldwell believed kept the world organized. Graves had been her commanding officer in Marja. He'd been the man who authorized her to stay behind when the order came to evacuate. He'd been the man on the radio when she held the aid station for 6 hours, treating 53 special operations personnel, while Apache gunships painted the valley and the heat turned blood on bandages into something that looked like rust. He'd been the man who certified her condition when the disavowal happened, the official erasure, the funeral service without a body, the death certificate signed by people she'd never met. That alert hit his desk at 0530 hours on Monday morning. By 0600 hours, his call went out to the Ranger Company stationed at Fort Hood, 45 minutes north. By 0640 hours, a UH-60 Black Hawk was lifting off toward San Antonio, carrying 2 Rangers in full dress uniform and authorization that made federal law enforcement look like a suggestion. Natalie finished her coffee at 3:11 a.m. The liquid had gone cold enough that she could drink it in one long pull. She placed her hand on the combat boots beside her, feeling the leather worn smooth by 4 years of storage and a lifetime of service. The boots were patient. They could wait. They'd waited this long. She didn't know what was already in motion. She didn't know that a classified alert had been triggered. She didn't know that Graves had read her name on a screen and immediately understood what had happened, that someone in civilian authority had discovered something they weren't supposed to discover and set it in motion anyway. She didn't know that in less than 3 hours, the parking lot at Cedar Creek Medical would be filled with the sound of rotor blades that would rattle windows on the 3rd floor and trigger car alarms across for city blocks. She only knew that the diner's fluorescent lights hummed above her with the sound of insects trapped in amber, and that her reflection in the window looked like someone who'd already died once and was just now running out of places to hide. The rotor blades arrived before dawn, and Cedar Creek Medical's parking lot transformed into a landing zone. The sound hit first, a percussion that rattled 3rd-floor windows and triggered car alarms across for city blocks. Natalie didn't hear it from inside the diner. She was already moving. Her phone had buzzed at 4:08 a.m. No caller ID. Just coordinates and a single word, move. She'd trained for this moment for 13 years, but muscle memory is different from readiness. Muscle memory doesn't account for the weight of returning from the dead. The Black Hawk touched down on the visitor parking lot at 5:23 a.m., rotors still turning, creating a vortex of debris that scattered across employee vehicles like a warning. 2 Rangers in full tactical gear descended before the skids fully contacted asphalt. They moved with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators, trained men on a classified errand, not a drill. Security guard Marcus Webb, a Desert Storm veteran with 28 years on the job, looked up from his desk as the Rangers pushed through the automatic doors. He took one look at their insignia, their bearing, and understood immediately. These weren't hospital security consultants. "You're here for Hayes," he said. It wasn't a question. The lead ranger, call sign breaker, tattoo of a compass rose on his neck, nodded once. Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. She work night shift. Marcus stood slowly. She did. Left about 2 hours ago. What's this about? Need to find her. Now. Where would she go? Before Marcus could answer, the second ranger was already moving toward the ER entrance, radio handset pressed to his jaw, coordinates flowing in the kind of tactical shorthand that civilians never quite understand. Breaker turned back toward the hallway, and that's when Dr. Caldwell appeared, still in last night's scrubs, badge clipped to his collar, eyes widening as the situation crystallized in front of him. He saw the tactical gear. He saw the insignia. He saw his world collapsing in real time and couldn't move fast enough to stop it. "Gentlemen," Caldwell said, voice steady but too high, "I don't know what this is about, but if you're looking for a staff member." Breaker held up one hand, and Caldwell's words died. The silence that followed was the kind that comes only in early morning hospitals, when the night shift has handed off but the day shift hasn't fully arrived. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm in the distance. The monitors beeped their lonely cadences. Breaker pulled a tablet from his assault pack and began reading as if Caldwell didn't exist. Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. Navy Cross. 2 silver stars. Medical Advisor to Joint Special Operations Command. Designated call sign Reaper 6. Credited with saving 53 Special Forces operators during Operation Enduring Freedom, Marja deployment, 2009 to 2010. Final status, killed in action, July 2010, during Black Operation, Kandahar Province. Records erased. Next of kin notified. Status sealed. The words hung in the fluorescent light like an accusation. She's been dead for 13 years, Breaker continued, eyes still on the tablet. According to official records. But somebody at this hospital tried to access classified personnel files. Somebody tried to manufacture false evidence about her credentials. Somebody attempted to forge documents from Naval Personnel Command. That's a federal crime, Doctor. Caldwell's face was the color of old hospital sheets. The ER doors slid open. Natalie stepped through them in jeans and a gray hoodie, combat boots laced tight, the only uniform she needed. She didn't look surprised. She looked like someone who'd been expecting this moment since the night she sat in a diner and decided whether to disappear completely or let herself be found. Behind her came Lance Corporal Chen, healthy and walking, and Staff Sergeant Williams in a wheelchair, prosthetic leg gleaming under the harsh hospital lights. Rodriguez the EMT was there too, still in his department polo, because some people you save don't forget. And Dr. Morrison stood by the triage desk, having received a phone call that morning with simple instructions, be here at 5:45 a.m. Natalie looked at Caldwell with eyes that were no longer a nurse's eyes. They were the eyes of someone who'd held dying men in her hands and made decisions that civilians don't have the vocabulary to discuss. She'd been reduced to a nurse because it was tactical. She'd worn deference like a surgical mask. She'd let him humiliate her because the alternative was exposing something that the government wanted to remain hidden. Now her voice dropped an octave. "You triggered a classified alert when you requested access to my records, Doctor. You didn't know what you were looking for. You just knew you wanted me gone." Caldwell stepped backward, and Natalie took a step forward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. 53 operators came home because of decisions I made in the field. 53 families didn't receive a folded flag. When you tried to forge military documents to discredit me, you committed a federal felony. And you did it for spite. The second ranger was speaking into his radio, confirming coordinates. Outside, another vehicle pulled into the parking lot, federal credentials visible on the windshield, unmarked sedan, the kind of car that carries people who don't exist in any official capacity except on very specific lists. Dr. Marcus Sterling Caldwell, the ranger said, reading from the tablet again, "You're under federal investigation for attempted tampering with military records, falsification of official documents, and obstruction of federal personnel. You have the right to remain silent." The rest happened in the way these things do when the federal government decides you're a problem. Caldwell's wrists were thin, soft-skinned, unaccustomed to the cold metal of handcuffs. His protests echoed down the corridor as they led him toward the exit. No dignity, no mercy, no one in the hallway turning to look because they'd already seen enough to know that this was the kind of thing you don't witness if you value employment. The ranger with the compass rose tattoo turned back to Natalie. "Command wants you at Brook Army Medical. Full reinstatement. Your clearance is active. Welcome home, Master Chief." She nodded once. That was all. The hospital around them seemed to exhale. Marcus returned to his security desk as if Rangers and federal agents and the resurrection of dead soldiers was just Tuesday in San Antonio. Dr. Morrison turned back to his charts. Lance Corporal Chen looked at Natalie and mouthed thank you, and she saw in his face all the years that stretched ahead of him now, career, family, a lifespan that Caldwell's vendetta had almost stolen. The next 18 months unfolded in the way that classified problems resolve, quietly, behind layers of security clearance, in rooms where the air tastes like oakwood and old money. Federal investigators discovered the full scope of Caldwell's pattern. For other nurses, 6 years, same technique, questions about credentials, suggestions of falsification, pressure until they resigned. His network of board members fractured when they realized they'd been used to launch a harassment campaign against a woman the government had officially erased. The news outlets ran the story once, then moved on, local ER director charged with federal records tampering. His mugshot showed a man who'd believed his network was impenetrable, his power absolute. His medical license suspended. His wife filed for divorce on Wednesday. His brother-in-law, the attorney, declined to represent him citing conflict of interest. By month 3, his legal bills exceeded $180,000. By month 6, he'd pleaded guilty to falsification of federal records and accepted a suspended sentence that included 200 hours of community service. 18 months after the Black Hawk landed, Natalie stood on a stage at Fort Sam Houston's Joint Base Auditorium wearing dress blues that fit perfectly, uniform adorned with ribbons that didn't photograph well because the colors were so dark they nearly disappeared against the fabric. Her boots had been polished by someone else for the first time in 13 years, her assistant, a young petty officer first class who treated her the way sailors treat legends. The auditorium was filled with 50 people who owed Natalie Hayes their lives. Lance Corporal Chen sat in the front row, whole and healthy. Staff Sergeant Williams stood on his prosthetic next to a woman who'd become his wife after he came home alive. Rodriguez wore his old uniform, looking dignified in a way that community college CPR instructors never quite manage. The Admiral read her commendations in a voice that carried the weight of classified operations. Marja, 2009. Kandahar, 2010. 13 years of field medical work that would never appear on any official roster. When he finished, all 50 service members stood simultaneously and saluted, holding the position for exactly 15 seconds. It was the kind of salute you give to someone who's already died and came back anyway. Someone who sacrificed without expecting recognition. Someone who held the line when the line was just you and your training and the knowledge that people were counting on you not to break. Afterward, a young combat medic approached nervously, couldn't have been more than 22, face still soft with youth, medical bag worn and repaired multiple times. "Master Chief, I'm deploying to Syria next month. Medical attachment. Any advice?" Natalie considered this carefully. She'd given this speech in field tents and helicopter cargo bays and once in a diner at 3 a.m. to no one at all. "The protocols exist for good reason," she said. "But in the field, your job isn't to follow procedures. It's to bring people home. Trust your training. Trust your hands. And remember, power isn't a title. Power is the ability to help." The medic nodded, saluted, and walked away with something he'd carry for the rest of his operational life. That evening, Natalie drove past Cedar Creek Medical on her way to Brook Army Medical Center, where her security clearance and rank weren't just recognized, they were required. The night shift nurses were changing over, visible through the bright windows, going about the work of keeping people alive in the dark hours. She thought briefly about the version of herself who'd sat in a diner at 3 a.m. with combat boots and nothing ahead. She thought about Caldwell teaching CPR certification classes at San Antonio Community College, making $12 an hour, wearing a polo shirt with the college logo instead of the custom-tailored dress shirts he once favored. Students called him Mr. Caldwell because his medical credentials no longer existed. He taught in a building where CNAs learned bedmaking technique. Her combat boots sat in a shadow box now, mounted on her new office wall at Brooke Army Medical, with a simple brass plaque, Marja 2010. She didn't need to hide anymore. The world had been reminded that the quietest people in hospitals sometimes carry the heaviest secrets. That power isn't something you claim, it's something you've already earned through sacrifice nobody sees. That heroes walk among us in scrubs and combat boots and diners at 3 a.m., deciding whether it's worth surviving just to prove that they were right all along. If you made it this far, you understand something most people miss: the people who've survived the worst are often the ones who give the most. Hit that subscribe button. Comment below what you would have done differently. And if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, I want to hear your story.